Was lifting the FDA red tape for the COVID vaccine the most libertarian thing that Trump did? Is the layoff of journalists at corporate press outlets a good thing? And what should we think about the whole Texas situation? We'll answer these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather takes that we see in our social media feeds and we lay out whether we think they are good or bad. My name is Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. You can find us on, and it's not going. Oh my goodness. I'm not sure why it's doing that. I'm going to re-roll again. I'm just going to leave it up. All right. And let's make sure that all the slides go in. All right. Take 3. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather takes that we see in our social media feeds and we critique or praise them. My name is Britt and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe. You can find us on Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into a few of these takes. So the first one is a DM that was sent to the R Street Institute Policy think tank. And it reads, "It's interesting to me how you discuss serious topics of legislation when the big picture that your party is run by, when the big picture is that your party is run by a corrupt madman is mostly ignored. It seems like the most pressing problem." What do you think?
This is just really funny because anyone who is familiar with think tanks and things like, and generally that world, knows that most think tanks are 501c3s, which are inherently, you can't be political. You're not allowed to endorse candidates. And so it's very funny that, one, this person's instantly jumping to, oh, you guys are apparently they run the Republican Party. And then two, the idea that an institution that's set up to try to address specific policy concerns should be addressing the leader of the Republican Party. It's so funny. It's like people can't understand the idea that in society, their specialization is good, right? So, for instance, this is one of the things why when it comes to liberty, I call myself both an incrementalist and a radicalist, in that I like radical jumps into good policy, but I also like all of the approaches that are going to take us there incrementally. And having different groups that are good at those different things is a good thing. It's better that you can have people focused on specific changes and people who are pushing the envelope in the fullest. And so in the same way, it's funny that this one person, even if R Street Institute was this Republican think tank, which I think a lot of Republicans probably have a problem with their ideas on like Section 230 and regulating big tech, because they're a little bit more libertarian in that. It's very funny. Even if they were Republican, the idea that you can't have an institution set up to advance specific policy ideas, they have to be addressing the political situation, just shows kind of the binary thinking that so many people get into, that I think is fed mostly by drama and media highlights. It happens both in the corporate and in sort of digital media landscape, when you sort of make every issue the national issue. Everything relates to Donald Trump. And I think that's a really bad mindset to have. It's obviously important that you should prioritize issues. You shouldn't make every single issue of the same weight, but you should also recognize that certain institutions can be set up to address specific needs that aren't the big national news media. Like, for instance, I mean, I'm glad when there are groups in Washington that are focused on Washington issues and not just national issues, because like where I work, we stop a lot of bad things that would happen here and we advance good things happening here, even if it's not, addressing Donald Trump or Joe Biden specifically.
Yeah, this is like a weird mix of like whataboutism and like ad hominem. It's like, I'm assuming this person took some issue with some legislation, prescription, or article that this think tank wrote about some legislation that was up for vote. And rather than actually engage with whatever the argument is, it's like, well, you're the party of Donald Trump, so like everything that you have should be ignored. And it kind of reminded me of, I've talked about this before on the show, but I had this dialogue with this person on Facebook, and she had been saying things like, well, every scientist believes that like abortion is fine, and I was like, no, actually there was a study done and it shows that, basically 99.9% of biologists agree that, life begins at conception. And she's supposedly a PhD student, and she went and looked at the paper that I cited, and she saw that Donald Trump was listed as a source in it. And she quickly was like, "Well, Donald Trump is listed as a source, so there's no way that I'm going to accept this as, an authoritative paper." And it's like, well, Donald Trump is listed as a source, in the intro paragraph because it was quoting him in it, right? You got to cite who you quote and where you quoted them from. And so Donald Trump had given some interview on Fox News, and so they had to cite that because they referenced it. But this person had, like, even though she's a PhD student and writes papers supposedly, she instead of engage with the actual argument that the paper is making, was like, well, it's Donald Trump, so I'm just going to attack that instead. And they put so much emphasis on that, like, oh, he's a corrupt madman, that he's awful and everyone should hate him, and that's reason enough that they feel like they don't actually have to engage with any of the arguments. The thing, though, that kind of struck me about this, at least, like, I don't really know our street or like whether they are good or bad on stuff in general. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of most Republican like think tanks and stuff, but and some of them are really good. But like Donald Trump, like the thing that's good about Donald Trump is not when he is doing like what the intellectual elites like policy subscriptions or prescriptions are. It's that he is viewed as a bull in a china shop, that he goes in there and he makes everything that was considered sacred and untouchable and like, oh, like we have these sacred cows. Like he just says, nope, I'm not going to, adhere to those. And I'm going to reveal it for the facade and the clown show that it actually is. So that doesn't necessarily relate to whether, what this person is trying to talk about with the legislation or anything, but it just was interesting to me. I think that the only redeeming quality about Trump is that he is a madman, not necessarily that he's corrupt, but that he is a madman and that he shows everything for what it really is.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Trump's best features are often the things that people complain about, yes, but they complain about it because they're almost told to complain about it. I mean, one of the great examples that from his early presidency is people freaking out over him leaving the Paris Climate Accords. And if you look at what the Climate Accords would have actually done if they had been binding, which they were not, it would have been disastrous. It would have been absolutely terrible for our economy. And I think we may have rebound ourselves under Biden. But again, it's all not non-binding specifically. But you look at the effects of local legislation that follows along certain emission guidelines and things like that. And it's terrible. And so everyone started criticizing Trump for these things. Like, oh, he pulled us out of the climate accords. And it's like, yeah, no, that was one of the good things.
Yes.
And so he has this magic power of making people complain about the things he's good on and then having people and then having people praise him on the things he's bad on. So that's just a general thing. And again, to me, the main takeaway here, though, is it's like recognize like who you're complaining to. This is just a general social media thing. It's like going to the airline, customer support rep and then complaining when your flight's canceled. Like, wow, like, well, I need to be there by tomorrow. And it's like, it's not, and getting mad and yelling expletives at them. It's like, it's not the customer service person's fault. They can't make a plane fly tomorrow. And so you're going to this think tank and it's like, you're the leader of the Republican Party is a corrupt madman. You need to address that. And it's like, we talk about policy issues like on trying to prevent the government from regulating tech and stuff like that. Like, what are you doing? This is
a Wendy's.
yeah, exactly. So it made me laugh, and I just wanted to highlight it. If you're going to complain to someone about this issue that you think they ought to be addressing, maybe find out a little bit about the organization or the person first. I mean, it'd be like me going to, I don't know, like Vivek Ramaswamy and being like, man, I didn't really like the latest Decemberist album, man. What are you going to do about it? It's like, what? Like, what does that have to do with anything that he has to do?
Well, you listen to music.
yeah. You've listened to music before. You've made comments about music you've listened to. So yeah, it's just very funny to me. That's all.
Moving to our next one. We've got Noah Goldberg. He retweets himself. The first tweet that he writes, the LA Times newsroom today, what's missing? And it's empty. Just a bunch of computers and empty seats. And then he writes, well, I've gone viral apparently among people who think the LA Times is staffed by journalists who advocate for white genocide and are propagandists. They all believe that the layoffs were good.
Yeah, this is this take made me laugh because even though he doesn't technically go this far, it feels very much akin to Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment, and the complete lack of self-awareness about why people think this is good. It's the shortcut is, oh, people are celebrating the LA Times layoffs. They must be racists. You know, like that's his whole thing here. Like, if you think that layoffs are good, it's probably because you're a white supremacist racist. And I of course saw Michael Malice engaging on this and the original tweet and stuff. And you know, I mean, you know, Michael Malice speaks in very harsh terms and in terms that I would personally think are hyperbolic, although I don't think he would say they are. For instance, I saw someone commenting on the layoffs, and they said something about they gutted 8% of their staff, and you know, Michael Malice's response was, in a better society, the gutting would be literal or something.
Yeah.
And you know, it's one of those things where when you see that and you take the bait, and you know, Noah Goldberg is saying, "Oh man, anyone who celebrates this believes the journalists advocated for white genocide and are propagandists." Well, for one thing, they are propagandists, so that part is true, actually. But like, you know, you're trying to discredit the people instantly by saying things like they believe everyone there's a white advocating for white genocide. I don't believe that every LA Times journalist advocates for white genocide. I do believe that almost every LA Times journalist was in the service of someone who does advocate for at least a great restructuring of society where they can keep their power. And if that means going through the DEI racial divisions that would support something along those lines, I wouldn't be surprised, right? But you also have to recognize that that's not, you know, the propagandists thing is actually pretty true and pretty real, and you just have to look at the COVID years for that to be confirmed and validated. So to lack the self-awareness and just, again, to dismiss this, like, it just shows how out of touch you are with anything that's happened that's been important in the last 4 years.
What's always funny to me about all of these posts about the LA Times and the New York Times and all these journalists getting laid off and posting about it and being like, we're unionizing and we're going to go march for this or that. It's like they never actually, you know, they'll complain about people hating on them and stuff, but they never actually grapple with or answer why people kind of hate them. And another Michael Malice, and this is the one I thought you were going to reference, but his kind of go-to whenever a journalist, you know, throws a pity party on social media is like, I think you underestimate the, you know, the amount of disdain, utter disdain that the general American public has for you. And, you know, when Jordan B. Peterson and other people like him were getting, you know, he talked about how when you put something out in the world, a public statement, and you reach millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people, or maybe in the LA Times, thousands of people, you know, you're going to get negative feedback. And like, it's part of the negative feedback is to listen to it and to like evaluate it. And then to analyze, like, is there actual meat here or is it all just bones? And you chew the meat and you spit out the bones. And part of chewing the meat and part of spitting out the bones is answering that, right? Is grappling and being able to communicate. Like any good debater, you should be able to communicate your opposition's points and their argument back to them. And then if you can do that, then there's a chance that you can actually structure an argument against it. But all of these folks, if they were going to say why the general public has so much disdain for them, I mean, look right here. This guy's saying, well, they're just basically racists, right? Like that's what he's saying. That's these people who accuse us of white genocide and being propagandists. They're really just racist. They just really hate black people, and they want the status quo to stay. They want to keep their power, and you know, to quote Joe Biden, they want to put everyone back in chains and things like that. And so they make these assertions that don't actually represent the people that dislike them. They would never be able to communicate that, like, hey, the reason we don't like you is because you have an obvious talk track and you get obvious talk tracks from people that are above you, and they skew one way politically. And when it turns out they're wrong, like you don't even like issue really a correction about that. You just kind of move forward and provide, you know, coverage and cover for the people that did get it wrong, and you know, moving forward. And so, you know, it's like this weird, awful combination of like lack of self-awareness and then like purposefully blindness. Like it kind of like reminds me of when who's the Wonder Woman actor? I can't remember her name, but
Gal Gadot.
Yeah, Gal Gadot. They had the you know, the singing the Beatles song during COVID, you know, and all the celebrities were talking about like, imagine if there was no suffering, and they're singing it, and they're from their $1 million mansions as everyone else is locked down, and the mom and pop shops aren't able to make rent, and people are losing their jobs, and they're locked in their homes. And it's like, and they were like confused, like, why does everyone hate us right now? It's like, yeah, you're literally lecturing us from your $1 million homes, and while you're also advocating for the policies that are making us miserable, and then you're trying to like claim some virtue. And that's more or less what these journalists do, but they would never be able to recognize that because it would take some form of like, self-evaluation. And if they self-evaluated honestly, they might be really disappointed with what they saw.
Yeah, I was going to say it's funny because at the very least, the way that this should be communicated ought to be, it's really sad that we're in a time when people think that these journalism layoffs are good. Journalists do X, Y, and Z. That would be a much better way, at least, of formatting this kind of thing. But when you think about it, when has the LA Times ever held the government's feet to the fire, unless it was specifically Donald Trump, and specifically Donald Trump via claims that were propagated by the CIA or the FBI or the Clinton campaign or anything like that? They're only a regime tool, and there's no useful balance in that and its purpose. Now, you can argue that you think there's a lot of fake news online, and this is the counterbalance to that, but you also have to recognize then that it's not surprising that people believe these layoffs are good, because from that point of view, from our point of view, they have been, tools of the regime. So the fact that you can't even come to a place where you're not surprised by that is very sad, in my opinion. Like, you should at the very least acknowledge, like, okay, I think we're in a sad state of society that people are celebrating this, but I understand why, and we need to address that root problem. We need to address the root problem of, why there is this distrust between everyday people and the corporate mainstream media. Like, if your pulse or your hand is on the pulse of the American people, then that's your takeaway from this. Not like, oh, they just think everyone here is a conspiracy theorist or a white genocide promoter, things like that. So it just shows so many levels of a lack of awareness from them. And I don't know. I just think that, like, even if your perspective is that modern journalism is providing a useful service, modern journalism by way of corporate mainstream media, you at least should recognize where the disconnect is coming from, where at least people don't think that you are performing a useful or valuable service, and then address that. And I just see no reason. Like, it's just like not a trace of this in the tweet, just a blank face of like, why would they hate us? They're all delusional, and that's all you can think of.
It's really interesting because if you hear people in even a lot of conservative outlets talk about journalism, they kind of have a longing for the good old days or something like that, where it was honest journalism and journalists made sure that we got the truth and everything. It's like, well, what structurally was different about back then versus today that would incentivize journalists to or to not give the truth? And in my opinion, like, journalists have kind of almost always been this way, because the way that they make, at least let's say the corporate press journalists, there are some legitimately good journalists that do make a living seeking out the truth and presenting it. But the corporate press has always been somewhat this way, a tool of the regime to propagate, information that supports them and perpetuates their what they would like to have happen. And I think that an interesting development of social media and it becoming like basic PR and being able to influence your image and do these sorts of things to the general person has made us aware of like the motivations that naturally occur with having some form of reach and being able to command attention. And because the general person now understands that, they can make a post and maybe you've only got 400 people that follow you on Instagram and Facebook and things like that. But you make a post out there and you edit the filter and you choose what the caption is and you curate it. You do things like that, and we see all these other people doing things. You realize, like, oh yeah, like this isn't actually real life. Like, it's a curated version of it, and it serves some sort of personal agenda. We now realize that most people, including ourselves, have a motivation that is not necessarily what the truth is, but also like what is most beneficial to what we think our goals are and our end goals are. And so, with that realization, of like that nasty little part of us in our human nature. The people who have been doing it for a living for, the past 120 years, it's so clear to us what their motivations are. And for them to pretend that we don't all know what it is, that we all haven't experienced it, that we all haven't perpetuated it, that we all haven't, participated it in some way, is just so silly. And it adds to their like to the aloofness of their response. It's like, yeah, do you really think we don't know what you're doing? And the fact that they keep pretending just makes it so much worse for them. So there's some ones that have become aware, or some ones that have always been good and are they're usually also the target of the ire of these folks. But the vast majority of the corporate press, it's just a dying breed, and I think they will go away. They're going to go the way of the newspaper, and all the other forms of outdated media, and that's a good thing.
Agreed.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a Twitter user, and they write, the most libertarian thing Trump did as president was lift FDA red tape for COVID vaccines, and libertarians hate it. What do you think?
It's funny because on the one hand, there is an element of truth to this. The problem is, I don't think that anyone actually hated the way. I think there was a talking point about, oh, these COVID vaccines are rushed or whatever. That to me is not a substantive critique of the idea of lifting regulations, so much as when you put it in the broader context, the criticism is that this vaccine, which was quicker to market than typically is done, is now being mandated upon people. That's the key issue. I don't have a problem with a product being rushed to market to try to meet a demand, but the entire gist of why that would be a good thing is allowing people to choose that, to then say, if you want to take this, know that it was rushed, but if you want to, this is an option for you. And so the very fact that he lifted those regulations, I actually don't really have a big problem with. I think in general, the FDA is a terrible organization that hinders things needlessly and allows things that are terrible as well. Yeah. So it doesn't protect you from the bad things, and it slows down the good things. It's the worst of both worlds. But so my problem isn't that he rushed it. The problem is in the context, they rushed it and then made it mandatory, or basically shut down the world involving it, or shamed you, and prevented you from doing things without it. That's the issue. The fact that it was rushed isn't the problem. The fact that it was rushed made people distrust it more. It's one of those things where if this was something, and frankly, there's almost a good argument to be had why that's beneficial for libertarians in a sense to get our point across, because it showed that it wasn't about the safety of the thing, because it was rushed. If this had been done with something like, the common cold, like the flu, like a flu shot or something like that, and you required everyone, there probably would have been a lot more mass compliance because people were familiar and comfortable with it. But the principle of the thing would still be wrong, right? The principle of forcing people to inject things in their body without their choice, that would still be wrong. The fact that this was rushed highlighted the fact that, oh yeah, the government is violating your rights, and they actually don't care. They actually don't want to give you the freedom to choose, even if it is an experimental rushed, quote unquote vaccine. I've heard sort of discussions on whether or not that's an accurate term. I don't know enough to define whether or not it is, but the point is that it was rushed, it was experimental, and even in spite of those things, they don't give you the choice. You have to take it in order to fly to a certain place, or to go outside once you fly to a certain place, or things like that.
Yeah, this is the equivalent of saying, like you're saying, the mandated part is key to it. And let's just say that someone, like the government, said, hey, every person that has a house or lives in a house is forced to do a bathroom remodel. It's like, you have to do a bathroom remodel. And you're like, okay, like that kind of sucks. But, at least there's going to be some, if the government's saying you have to do the bathroom remodel, at least there's going to be some sort of standard of quality that has to be maintained with that. Because I'm being forced to fund these bathroom remodels. And then, they come in and say, well, guess what? We're going to get rid of, just for the bathroom remodels, all the other stuff, is still the same amount of regulation and pain and stuff to get through. But just for these bathroom remodels, we're going to remove all red tape and all liability. So if they come in and they don't even build you a bathroom, you're still going to have to pay for it, and we're not going to enforce anything with it. It's like, we would not call that libertarian. We would call that crony capitalism. Like, that's not actually a free market at work. That's selectively choosing which business is going to get a massive advantage in the market, and it's not actually providing proper incentives where people can react to it and actually get signals for what decision they want to make moving forward. So, we mandated these vaccines. Even before the vaccines were I guess we didn't they mandated them, then they were repealed, and then all that good stuff. But even before they attempted to mandate them, like, you were mandated to fund them, right? And so the argument for the reason a government needs to exist is like, well, if we didn't have the government, then drug companies would cut corners because there would be no regulations to keep them in line and stuff like that. And so then the one time, I guess there's many times, but the one time you're like forced to pay for it, like you're actually on the hook for it, where it's like directly affecting whether or not you have money in your bank account, and you can see it right then and there, and you have no choice in it. The government doesn't even do the stated function that it's supposed to do, which is make sure that it is safe and doing good. So yeah, it's libertarian in that you removed a regulation, but you only removed it for one, and you removed it for the benefit of a monopoly, and a government created monopoly at that. And we've done other episodes on this topic, but the only true monopoly that can exist is when the government enables it. And what more so than, a vaccine company that has no FDA regulation on it, and then it has no liability. So you're forced to fund it. And if it works or doesn't work for you, too bad, so sad. I mean, there's nothing libertarian about it at all. And Trump's response to COVID is terrible. Like, he did a really bad job on COVID, enabling people to shut things down, and then obviously keeping Anthony Fauci in place all the time and all this stuff. And so this, lifting of the FDA red tape is a string of bad decisions that paint an entire bad picture of Trump being, part of this huge health dictatorship that came down from COVID.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I really like that analogy about forcing everyone to have the bathroom remodel, because I could also see people saying, well, like, why is that not a bad thing? Like, don't you want clean bathrooms? Aren't you, like, why are you against health? And but it's very easy to see in that example, there are, in that case, literal costs associated with it, right? And even if they pay for it, that a bathroom remodel costs money, whether it comes from your pocket or not. And then when you think, okay, wait, I'm paying taxes, my tax dollars are going for this, I am paying for it, right? So it takes one more extra step there, but I think that illuminates the issue perfectly. So again, not an issue of lifting the red tape. That's not the problem. That's not what libertarians, at least not what good libertarians, are criticizing him on. On the contrary, it's all about the mandate.
Yeah, just to kind of dunk on the FDA a little bit further, like, I don't like it, right? It's terrible. The government does a really bad job already. But let's just say that, like, there was no FDA, but you had like a personal, like, drug advisor. So you're sick, and this drug advisor lets you know whether or not something is safe or not. And all these drugs could do everything from giving you a little bit of a stomach ache to making your arm fall off, or giving you a heart attack. And so if you were paying this drug advisor voluntarily to be the person that evaluates, like, hey, this is a good drug, or this is a bad drug, or this medicine will help or not help you, and they took a test that certified whether they were able to be the person to do that, and they had to present that certificate to you, and you use that certificate to evaluate whether you wanted to be in business with this person, what would you expect that percentage of them getting the test right to be? It's like, I would want it to be like basically north of 99.5%. Yeah. Like, they're basically right all the time on this. Because if I'm going to pay you to make a recommendation to me about what medicine I'm going to take and whether it could hurt or help me, like, I want you to be basically right all the time. Well, the FDA has about 32% of the drugs that they approve get recalled after approval due to some health effect that they missed out on, that they weren't able to document. So they do a terrible job of actually regulating when they are even allowed to do their job. They do a bad job of it. And not only that, but you're forced to fund it and forced to fund them. And they're kind of like considered the end all be all, but they're like, they barely get a C minus. They don't even get a C minus. They get a D plus on like a normal grading scale of their ability to accurately model whether a drug is helpful or not.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where, frankly, with the way that Western medicine is, like, you're never going to be able to account for everything. And so is there value in a service that tries to account for these things? And yes, there is. But if the FDA isn't doing it well, then we probably ought to recognize that there is a better way to do things, right? sure, there's not going to be one institution that's going to be able to perfectly control for all these things, but if there's an incentive to be more accurate, you probably want that to be the case. You want the very most important things in life, you want to be handled where there are strong incentives for it to be right. The FDA doesn't have any response, any incentives. Otherwise, I think you would see a much, much lower number than that 32%.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Andrew, author of America, Twitter verified, so we out them. And he writes, abortions have increased since Roe v. Wade was overturned. The only difference is more women and children are dying from them. There's nothing pro-life about the GOP's grotesque forced birth movement. What do you think?
I mean, I don't know that this is even true. I just wonder where he's getting any of these particular numbers for one thing, but the there's a lot of things about this take, but the first thing that just strikes me is forced birth. That is just such a gross term. It's like, for instance, me saying like, oh man, I didn't stab Brit today, and it's weird because this guy wants to make it there to be serious repercussions for me to stab Brit. So I guess he just wants me to have the restricted arm movement law here. That's like, okay, restricted arm movement, yeah, because I'm not plunging a knife into Brit's heart. Like, okay, forced birth is such a disingenuous term. Forced birth would imply that the alternative is a natural occurrence. Forced birth is not the natural, or birth is the natural progression of the way that biological system happens. When you intervene, that is when something different strikes course. So forced birth makes it sound like you're intervening to cause something that would not otherwise happen. But that's not how life works when it comes to birth. And so we have to recognize that, again, in the framing of everything, when you are causing an abortion, you are terminating a natural process of life. And I'm not saying that every instance of intervention in a natural process is wrong. There are certain cases where a natural process is occurring and an intervention is good, but you have to justify that. The burden is on the intervention to justify why it is not doing harm. And every abortion ends up with a murder, at least with one person dead. And so forced birth, it's not forced birth. Abortion is forced murder because every single abortion is going to require something that otherwise would be alive, be dead. So abortion is 100% forced murder. Birth and the prevention of abortion is not, that's just staying the hand of what would be murder. So that whole phrasing to me is sinister, even though there are broader things on the take. It's just the way that you think about it and frame it in your mind is completely dependent, this reveals how you are framing it in your mind. And I think it's sinister to call it forced birth. When even if I were to justify abortion, I would have to recognize that abortion is the specific intervention. And so the forcing of something, when you are, abstaining from doing something, that's not forcing the natural outcome. That is allowing the natural outcome to happen. Any intervention bears the burden of doing in the first place. So you can't force the natural occurrence.
One of the things that really bothers me about like this line of argumentation, and like you were saying at the top of your take, regardless of whether this is not true, that abortions have increased since Roe was overturned, like that. I think that there is, and my argument is that shouldn't have any bearing on whether or not we allow an unborn child's rights to be, upheld. And like, let's just say that when we lived in a society where murder was legal, and we had a murder rate of 1, and then we made murder illegal, and then murder rates went up 10% or something like that. It's like, I don't think anyone would ever advocate for that, like, oh, well, I guess that means that we need to just keep murder legal, and that people that get away with it, or that commit murder and that get caught are not prosecuted. Like, it'd be like, no, there was a wrong, the prescription of these laws and these rules and this cultural standard dictates like, hey, if you commit this action, then you are subject to this type of penalty because you violated some sort of right. And like that stands alone and in a vacuum outside of whether or not the pragmatic, outcome of whether or not abortions increase or decrease, like that's a reality, but that speaks more to the moral fabric of the people in the society than to the actual principle behind whether or not we should affirm or not affirm abortion. And it's really sad that there are more, if this is true, that there are more women and children dying from abortions. It's like you would think then that, it's not an option for us to kill innocent children. So therefore, the only option that is available to us is to be like, okay, well, we need to be educating people and making sure people and helping people live a more moral lifestyle so that they are not driven or desire to do abortions, that they have the strength of character to avoid that, and they have the strength of community to support them, and so they don't feel that they're despairing in that. So the answer is not, let's just legalize immorality and the violation of the most innocent of us in order so that we pragmatically think we have better outcomes. It's like, no, we actually have to have better character. We need to have stronger values and a better moral system. But that's almost, for whatever reason, the last option for people like this. It's like, no, we can't ask for the communities to be better. We can't ask people to try and live better lives. We just have to set up a system that works regardless of that. And it's like, well, no, you're actually, the reason we are at the point we are today is because you have taken all of the responsibility off of the community, off of family, off of individuals. And you said, look, the government is going to take care of it. And the government is always going to resort to, the lowest common denominator and the easiest solution. And unfortunately, with innocent children, it seems like to them, the easiest solution is just to kill them before they're ever born. And so it's just funny this person references like children are dying from them. It's like, yeah, the unborn children are. And yes, there are 14-year-old kids that are getting pregnant and that are trying to get an abortion that are dying. All of that is tragic. The solution is not making it more available. The solution is making people better and advocating for a more moral society. I'm not saying the government make people better. I'm saying let's, as a community, hold each other to a higher standard.
Right. It'd be akin to a society that starts drinking this water that has appeared from an alien spaceship, and it tastes really good. And then they realize that they have a disease in them, and they have to cut off their arms in order to live. And then we say, okay, well, this cutting off arms thing is terrible. We should not cut off our arms over this. And then people saying, okay, well, that's ridiculous. We need to let people keep cutting off their arms. Now, let's not do anything to address people stopping drinking the water. We're going to keep drinking the water, but we absolutely need to normalize and let people cut off their arms. It's like, look, in specific extreme examples, you make the entire realm of argument shouldn't be let's make arm cutting off widely available and celebrated. The whole range of that debate ought to be in a moral society. Are there extreme cases where we should cut off arms? To we should never cut off arms. Though that should be your range of debate on this. And the real debate should be, now let's get rid of this terrible water. In the same way, we ought to have a situation or a culture in which abortion is the last resort, if it is a resort at all. It should never be celebrated and told like we need this access. It should be a thing like this is a one-on-one medical procedure, and we don't celebrate this. There should never be an abortion of convenience. There should never be abortions that where they are otherwise avoidable. There should never be those. That shouldn't just be part of the normal cultural vernacular of choice. The last thing I'll say is when you're talking about the moral standards and the law, I think a lot of people would balk at that idea until they realize the implications. When you look at, I don't remember the country. I wrote a paper on this a while ago, and I'm blanking on the country right now, but there is a country that actually has legalized child pornography, which is just disgusting and terrible. And child abuse rates, reported at least child abuse rates in that country went down after the case. And you can make all kinds of arguments as to why. You can say correlation, not causation, whatever you want. But right now, the data suggests that legalizing child pornography lowers abuse in the natural in the country wide. Does that mean we ought to legalize child pornography? Absolutely not. But the problem is that if you're living in a utilitarian world, your viewpoint should be yes. And that continues even if you recognize the reality that, well, it's like, well, the children in these horrible, awful, tragic situations are being abused and their human rights are being violated. But if you're a utilitarian and all you care about at the end of the day is the number of people with the number of outcomes, then you have to recognize that condoning and allowing illicit behavior and torturous behavior and evil, vile behavior towards children is better when we allow it in these specific cases in order to hopefully reduce the outcome across the nation through it being legalized, being reported home. So it's a morally reprehensible position, and I think everyone's internal gut instinct tells them, no, wait, there's something wrong here, and we need to think about that. And that's the way that this argument ought to be treated in as one of the responses as well, which is to say, if these numbers are true, if abortion is causing this, does that make abortion something that we need? Is it something justifiable? And when you realize that no, murdering children is also an evil, abhorrent, and just vile, sickening thing to do, then you should recognize, okay, no, wait, we shouldn't actually expand access to abortions either.
Yeah. All right, we've got our last one here, and it's sort of big, but it's important. So this is a letter from Governor Greg Abbott, and it's regarding kind of the controversy over the past few weeks and months of the Texas southern border, particularly that Texas was enforcing their border with Mexico with barbed wire and other means, and then the federal government was coming in and trying to remove those means of enforcing the border. And then I think it was last week or the week before, the Supreme Court. First Abbott said, hey, sorry, guys, you can't be in here. We're going to detain you if any federal agents come in to try and remove this barbed wire. And then the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the federal government 5-4 that the federal government has the right to come in and do this stuff and destroy Texas's border with Mexico. So Greg Abbott writes this: the federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. The executive branch of the United States has a constitutional duty to enforce federal laws protecting states, including immigration laws on the books right now. President Biden has refused to enforce those laws and has even violated them. The result is that he has smashed records for illegal immigration. Despite having put on notice in a series of letters, one of which I have delivered to him by hand, President Biden has ignored Texas's demand that he perform his constitutional duties. He has violated his oath to faithfully execute immigration laws enacted by Congress. Instead of prosecuting immigrants for federal crime of illegal entry, President Biden has sent his lawyers into federal courts to sue Texas for taking action to secure the border. President Biden has instructed his agencies to ignore federal statutes that mandate the detention of illegal immigrants. The effect is to illegally allow their en masse parole into the United States. By wasting taxpayer dollars to tear open Texas's border security infrastructure, President Biden has enticed illegal immigrants away from the 28 legal entry points along this state's southern border bridges where nobody drowns and into the dangerous waters of the Rio Grande. Under President Biden's lawless border policies, more than 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years. That is more than the population of 33 different states in this country. This illegal refusal to protect the states has inflicted unprecedented harm on the people all across the United States. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and other visionaries who wrote the U.S. Constitution foresaw that states should not be left to the mercy of a lawless president who does nothing to stop external threats like cartels smuggling millions of illegal immigrants across the border. This is why the framers included both Article 4, which promises that the federal government shall protect each state against invasion, and Article 110, Clause 3, which acknowledges the state's sovereign interest in protecting their borders, Arizona versus United States. And the failure of the Biden administration to fulfill the duties imposed by Article 4 has triggered Article 110, Clause 3, which reserves to this state the right of self-defense. For these reasons, I have already declared an invasion under Article 110, Clause 3 to invoke Texas's constitutional authority to defend and protect itself. The authority is the supreme law of that authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes to the contrary. The Texas National Guard, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and other Texas personnel are acting on that authority as well as state law to secure the Texas border. Man, what do you think?
There's a lot in this to uncover and to talk about, but overall, it's really, really gutsy.
It is
really good, and frankly, I did not expect this from Greg Abbott, because Greg Abbott has been somewhat wishy-washy on things when they counted, and this does not seem wishy-washy. I think my favorite thing about this, rather than it being specific policy or specific citing things, is the framework understanding that, one, states have the right to fill in gaps that the federal government, when it doesn't take care, and not because I'm like this, oh, states' rights is a big thing. I mean, generally speaking, I prefer federalism, right? I like the idea of the more local the power, the usurping the more federal power. but I take this down to the level of individual and government, broadly speaking, because the general argument here is that the federal government says that they have this duty, and they're claiming they have a monopoly on this duty. And when they are not fulfilling the duty that they said they have the monopoly on, we are going to step in and take care of the issue. And to me, this is the principle of annulment. This is the principle of individuals breaking out from what, a government that just tells you you can or can't do something. Think about even the idea of public parks or public streets. It's like they tell you that they have the sole authority to control who's there, where it is, and when those streets are becoming unsafe because of, mentally unwell or drug addicted homeless people with knives, you as a citizen have to go out and take care of that issue. And this is, of course, the problem with the idea of public property and public location. And so, to me, I just see this whole ideology in this write-up for the specific instance of the border as a really liberty-backed idea that you can take and understand and apply again on the individual level with the government. When the government says, hey, we are not letting any private actors into this space, or we have the sole authority over this, and then they refuse, not only, it's not even like a matter of inadequately doing, although there's plenty of that, but oftentimes it's a matter of outright refusing to fulfill the duties therein, then you as the individual, or in this case, the state of Texas, not only has the right, but has the responsibility to step in and take care of the problem yourself.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk after the Supreme Court ruling came down, and people were saying, hey, Governor Greg Abbott should say, all right, Roberts has rendered his decision, now let him enforce it. And I was like, man, he's kind of like, of all the governors that are like, quote unquote, good, DeSantis in Florida, him in Texas, and then the gal up in North Dakota. I mean, Greg Abbott has kind of, like you're saying, been a little bit wishy-washy when it mattered most. And I was like, this is like pretty high stakes pressure in a lot of ways. But man, when he writes, for these reasons, I've already declared an invasion under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 to invoke Texas's constitutional authority to defend and protect itself, and that authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes. I was like, whoa, man, that's like, he's giving the proverbial middle finger to the federal government, saying like, oh yeah, like you guys suck and are weak and are not doing it. And he does the Thanos, like, I'll do it myself, and puts on the glove. That's like, that's pretty, for lack of a term, bad to do. Like, that's freaking awesome. And what's been really encouraging to me to see is that I think there's now 13 or 14 states that have followed suit in supporting Texas. Now, as you and I were talking about before the show started, like there is a really terrifying element of this, of like, okay, when this type of big federal authority is challenged, and you're saying like, hey, you're doing a bad job, we're gonna take it from here, settle down. There is a temptation, and there will be, and I'm sure they're brewing right now, to use force to reclaim that authority and that like, oh, I'm a strong man deal, and particularly coming from Washington D.C. and Biden. And that almost never results in good things when two big entities with military force and might decide that they're going to call each other's bluff and do things. So I hope that this is not a nothing burger, that it results in more people seeing that the federal government kind of sucks, and that it's best when, like you were saying, power is wielded locally, and the more local, all the way down to the individual, the better. But I'm also hoping that it is a nothing burger, in that we don't come to blows, for lack of a better term, from it, because no one wants civil war like that. And so this is going to be a nice little stress test of not only these states, but just the country as a whole in terms of what we'll tolerate, because I don't think that Biden would do anything crazy in an election year if the general consensus from the public wouldn't allow, was against that. And we're gonna see here in a second, like, both what the general public's opinion is, as well as what Biden's thoughts are on what the or whoever controls them, what they think the general public thinks.
Yeah, I mean, this happening in an election year, in particular with an election year in which Donald Trump will be facing so many different felonies, and so his, the tinder already being set per se for an explosion of, if there's some attempt to not let him run, And then you have this, and it feels, people who are feeling the burdens of the mass immigration coming in, already being on edge, and then them being told you can't fix this problem. I mean, we're really, really getting close to something blowing up, like you're saying, and I hope that we don't. Um, I kind of hope that this big showing and the solidarity from the states governors that have pledged their support to Texas, I really hope that rather than inflaming things, I hope that it causes the federal government to back down.
Yes.
But I don't know that I would necessarily think that's the natural
They're
course
kind
of
of
action.
back in a corner,
Right. Because, from the federal government's perspective, they rightly are thinking, well, if we don't stop them now, like what will stop them in the future from defying some sort of order? And then you begin to realize, oh yeah, all power is literally just who has the bigger gun or who has the perceived air of legitimacy that will make people do what I say. And when it comes to, oh wait, they're not giving me the credence of the air of authority and legitimacy, we have to break out the bigger guns. And so, frankly, if I was the federal government and if I had that perspective, I don't think I would be tempted to back down, just from a game theory standpoint. And so that's what's scary to me. But again, I also think that it's frankly about time that someone actually in a meaningful way stands up to the federal government running over the rights of people. Now, again, whether or not you believe that the specific action here is humanitarian or not, the razor wire on the border. I mean, frankly, again, and even this is departed from whether or not you think a country ought to have a border in this way. And all of this aside, the purpose of a border, the purpose of, if it exists, is to be a border. And so when people talk about, oh, well, you can't put razor wire on the top of a border, that's inhumane. It's like, well, okay, but the people who are choosing to climb that are specifically choosing to violate the thing that it's designed to do. It's kind of like saying, well, we ought to have bullets that kill people without hurting them. And it's like, okay, but the whole point of, rushing someone to try to rob them isn't, at the point of the gun, that that's the risk you're taking. When you're trying to cross over into a border, there's no confusion. No one sees the border wall and thinks, well, I'm supposed to get through here. And so, again, whether or not you think it's humane, it's clearly something that I personally think that if it's an individual, they have the right to do. And I don't love, states enforcing things, but if the government's saying that we are a country and we have a border and you have to get in this way, and then refuse to, put any level of enforcement behind that, then I do think Texas has the right to do that. Because again, it's not a matter of them saying, hey, we're going to force all our citizens to do something that's inhumane. We're going to force all our citizens to take this experimental vaccine and inject it in their body. They're merely saying, we have this border set up. And if you have a problem with the border policy, argue that. But if the border exists, you're not to cross it. And that's what it is. A border is not to be crossed, and they're enforcing it and making it that's what it is. So if you have a problem with that, your problem shouldn't be that whether or not there's the razor wire on top or not. It should be that there's a border at all. That's really the only, because anything less than that is just an easier way for people to violate that border. And that's just the reality that exists.
Yeah. Yeah, and I liked what you were saying about it's either who has the bigger gun or has the bigger air of legitimacy. And what we're seeing here, both here and during the COVID years, with states and how they all responded differently, is that the nice thing about the way the United States of America is set up is that you kind of what would be the term? You dilute where the air of legitimacy can be placed, and that like people do think of themselves as, I live in Washington State or I live in Texas or wherever, and my governor is Greg Abbott or my governor is unfortunately Jay Inslee. And so you have a little bit of this like, well, that is the authority in the state that I live in. Yes, we are in some sort of compact with the broader states, and then the people that manage that is the federal government. But like it's not like we're in another some of these other countries that have some form of uniform like national identity, where it's like the North and the South are basically the same, and there is no individual identity of these different places. And so therefore we can unilaterally impose our will, and there's not really a way for people of like mind to grant their air of legitimacy to someone that also shares their viewpoints. And so I think the COVID, silver lining of the COVID years is that we started to see a bit of nullification from states. I think Texas actually, in particular, did say, and I guess Greg Abbott did a good job here when Biden was trying to pass down the mandate. They went the opposite way, and they said, "Hey, if you're going to be a company here in Texas, if you're not allowed to have a vaccine mandate in Texas." And so things like that chip away at the air of legitimacy of the federal government and return power to closer to the actual people that are living with these realities. And I think that's what's key here, right? Like Texas understands the reality, sees the reality, has lived with the reality of illegal immigration like this for decades at this point. And they are the best ones to determine what and propose the right solution for it, which they're doing. And they're saying, hey, I like how he writes. Obviously, I bet this letter was gone over tons of times by all this guy's advisors.
No doubt.
He's like, hey, I hand delivered a letter to the president. It's like, yeah, they made every effort to try and tell the president what needed to happen. The people on the ground, management by walking around, and they have not, Biden has not given us what we need, and he's not enforcing his duties. So we're going to do it. And that's how it should work. And hopefully this inspires not only just at the state level for it to continue happening, but maybe also at like the county level, down to the town level, and maybe even the individual level at some point. Because really the logic that guides this being an awesome thing that's happening cascades all the way down to us as individuals.
Absolutely right.
Awesome. Well, folks, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. Again, please give us a like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. It helps us out, and we'll catch you on the next one.